Hello and a very warm welcome to Moneycontrol.com. The countdown to the interim budget has begun. In less than 24 hours from now, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present the country's finances and set the vision for the government. As the Prime Minister Narendra Modi articulated this morning, just a little while ago, that Finance Minister will present the budget with Disha Nirdeshak Baatein. What are the imperatives for this budget? What are India's vulnerabilities at this point? And should the government continue with its capex push or opt for fiscal consolidation? To understand what's working for India and what isn't, I have with me Samiran Chakraboarty from the Citigroup, Mr. DK Srivastava from EY India, and Mr. DK Joshi from Crisil. But before we go to our guests, let's quickly listen in on what the Prime Minister had to say this morning regarding the budget.
एक दिशा निर्देशक बातें लेकर के देश की वित्त मंत्री निर्मला जी हम सबके सामने कल अपना बजट पेश करने वाली है। साथियों, मुझे विश्वास है कि देश नित्य प्रगति की नई नई ऊंचाइयों को पार करता हुआ आगे बढ़ रहा है। सर्वस्पर्शी विकास हो रहा है, सर्वांगीण विकास हो रहा है, सर्व समावेशक विकास हो रहा है। ये यात्रा जनता जनार्दन के आशीर्वाद से निरंतर बनी रहेगी। इसी विश्वास के साथ फिर आप सभी को मेरा राम राम।
Thank you. Well, let's move on now to my guests, Samiran, Mr. Joshi, and Mr. Srivastava. Let me begin with you, Samiran. What is the sense that you get with Disha Nirdeshak Baatein? What are your expectations from this budget? What's the sense that you're getting?
So thanks, Shweta, for having me on the show. I guess there are two issues that the Finance Minister will have to deal with, and it's actually not a case of or but and. So there is an issue of doing more capex, which has been the trend of the last few budgets, and then there is an issue of fiscal consolidation, which the last few budgets have done in a very credible way. So this is one of those times when, although it's difficult, but the Finance Minister will have to contribute to both these things. The tricky part is that this is also a pre-election budget. So to what extent there will be some element of populism that feeds into this complicated equation is something that we have to see. I personally don't think that this budget, being an interim one, a vote on account one, will have lots of new policies in it. It would more be a recap of all the achievements of the government over the last 5 years and what policies have been put in place already. We will hear more about that, the success of those policies. But coming back to the basic question, it's going to be a budget of both capex and consolidation.
Interesting. Mr. Joshi, to come to you, as Samiran said that this is a pre-election budget. Do you think, are you getting a sense that the government might go for some measures to boost consumption? Because that's something that, India has been struggling with at this point. And what are the big numbers that you will be watching out for?
Well, first, thanks for having me on the show. I don't think government will give a consumption boost, because if you look at their fiscal strategy all through, I think they have resisted direct consumption boost to the economy, and I think they have moved more towards capex, I think, as Samiran was pointing out. So now I think whether they will be able to increase the capex at the same rate as they did last year, I think that's going to be a key question. Because the math behind reduction of fiscal deficit I think we'll have to lean on reduction of capex also to some extent. I think even though I believe that capex will still grow faster than GDP, I think that's what the budget is going to do. I think as far as the need for some welfare scheme is concerned, I think that probably is more in the rural areas, and because the agriculture hasn't done well. So it's a possibility that you might see some support for rural economy, whether it comes as direct transfers or it comes in the form of a social safety net. I think that's what we'll have to watch out for, because both have different implications. But I would say that I think the government will maintain its fiscal thrust on increasing the productive capacity of the economy, which is focus on investments, although they'll pull back a little bit. Consumption, big consumption support, I don't think I don't expect it to be the part of the interim budget.
Okay, Mr. Srivastava, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Mysore. I think that's where you're joining us from. I want to ask you about this note that was put out by the Department of Economic Affairs, which said that the economy is expected to grow at 7.3% for this fiscal and at about 7% for 24-25. So if we were to look at the context, the economic context in which this budget is being presented, it does give us a sense that things are going very well at a time when globally economies are growing between 2 to 3%. We're talking about a 7% growth. If you could just share some perspective with us on, what are the vulnerabilities for India at this point, and what are the positives that are working for India?
Well, thank you very much. I think that the review paper that has been brought out by the Ministry of Finance indicates a medium-term growth path of 7%. in the presence of continuing global challenges. And this can be achieved only by ensuring that domestic factors contribute significantly to growth, so much so that they can overcome the negative contribution of net exports. Now, to be able to do that, the budget will have to maintain a thrust on growth, and that is to be domestically driven. It is better to drive it through investment prioritization rather than giving a fillip to consumption expenditure, because we are short of demand, and that demand is better, which is if it is to be financed by additional liabilities, then it is best to create capacity and additional assets. So between the two routes of stimulating consumption or investment, I think it is the investment route which is more relevant for India at the moment. At the same time, they have to indicate to the rating agencies and the policy watchers at large that India is well on its way also for fiscal consolidation. Now that we have missed the FRBM targets ever since the COVID shock by massive margins. We have not been able to restore that fiscal consolidation path. In fact, the budgets had not indicated any convincing path as to how to bring it down to the FRBM debt target of 60% or 3%. So I think a balance will have to be established, a path will be shown, and investment prioritization will continue to be the focus of the budget.
Okay, let me bring in Samiran. Samiran, considering now that India has been listed in the bond indices, clearly India's numbers are going to be under greater scrutiny. In terms of transparency, what would you like to see the government do? Because you are constantly interacting with global heads of companies and global investment firms and so on. So, what according to you would make for a good vote on account?
So, Shweta, let's put it this way, that the worries on India's fiscal are much lesser now than what it used to be earlier, despite the investors understanding that the general government deficit of the country is quite high compared to the peer countries with which we are compared with. And similarly, our debt to GDP ratio is also very high. But given the the specific nature of financing that we have, of the almost the entire fiscal being financed domestically, I have really hard of investors being concerned on the extent of fiscal. In fact, the kind of demand for these bonds that we have seen in the last couple of years from some of the captive buyers like banks, insurance companies, pension funds, etc., have been far in excess of what the historical trends would have suggested. So the key question is that what Mr. Srivastava was also hinting at is that if we can credibly show a path towards fiscal consolidation to 4.5% of GDP in the near term on the central government fiscal deficit, and to get the debt to GDP below 80%, then there is a strong case for looking at a rating upgrade for the economy. That will be a big kicker, because the country premium that investors would typically ask for, that country premium would be relatively lower. But in the short term, just the process of getting fiscal deficit down and debt to GDP down, I think that's going to be good enough for investors to keep their trust on India's fiscal number. And
what's the magic number? Yes, sorry. Go on, Samiran. Finish your point. Yeah.
So just one small point is that this government has also shown a lot of fiscal transparency by bringing in off-balance sheet items into on-balance sheet. That's also another aspect which investors give a lot of credit to the government.
So what's the magic number that you think the rating agencies would want to see?
I mean, we know that in a very mathematical way, 5.2 is what the government should be targeting this year. But I think a number 10, 20 basis point here and there from that number would not be that bad an outcome given that we are in a pre-election year.
Right. So, Mr. Joshi and I were having a chat only yesterday, and he had mentioned that this budget will have something to give manufacturing a boost. This morning, a notification has come reducing the import duty on mobile phones from 15% to 10%. So, I want to bring in Mr. Joshi here. Mr. Joshi, you know, you mentioned that manufacturing, PLI schemes, these schemes could get a further push in this budget. Now, since this is a pre-election year, in terms of you know, a push towards social sector schemes and push towards manufacturing, which area do you think is the government likely to focus on, and what would you like to see the government do?
I would say that the manufacturing is more important, because we have been trying to push manufacturing for so many years, and the manufacturing share in GDP has hardly risen. Now there is renewed vigor. So far, I think, and this is the age of industrial policy. Countries are coming with their own industrial policies to support their own manufacturing, be it advanced countries or emerging markets. And I think here, what we have done in PLI has so far managed to prop up investments in segments like assembly type operations, which is electronics or maybe pharmaceuticals. But the real big capital intensive segments like auto, specialty steel, and photovoltaic cells, etc. I think there the movement has been slow. So you need to push that faster, because I think those are so far only the less capital intensive segments have succeeded in PLI. So the transition towards more capital intensive segment will require more support from the government. I think it could be ease of doing business, but it could also be maybe extending some of the benefits ahead to some new segments, I mean.
Okay, let me go across to Mr. Srivastava. Mr. Srivastava, you heard the Prime Minister say that the interim budget in which the Finance Minister is likely to do some Disha Nirdeshak baatein. What would you like to see the Finance Minister spell out in terms of a vision? Clearly, the government is expecting to come back into power in the general elections in 2024. When we talk about Disha Nirdeshak, what according to you would be a good Disha for the government to look at the moment?
Well, I think as far as the overall target is concerned, the objective is increase in per capita income and then eventually becoming a developed country. But that, of course, is the long-term goal. I would like to see the government to recognize that there are certain constraints that are arising from the global conditions, and there is a cost that is to be borne as we choose more and more capital-intensive techniques. Infrastructure spending is also capital-intensive. And the more we choose capital-intensive methodologies, employment situation will come under challenge. So I would like to see the government to recognize not only the possibilities and potentials, but also to lay out a realistic direction by recognizing some of the challenges that the Indian economy would also face as we transition towards becoming a developed economy. One challenge is, of course, on the employment situation. The other is fiscal consolidation in the presence of demand for higher and higher social sector spending. And it is establishing a balance between the objective of growth, the objective of employment, and the objective of supporting lower and middle income groups. That kind of balance should be indicated by the budget.
Right. Let me take this thought forward with Samiran. Samiran, what according to you are the key vulnerabilities for India at this point?
So it's if I take a step back, India's economic cycles, if you see, in those economic cycles, typically the demand side used to move first and hit a ceiling on the supply side because the supply side would not have expanded as much, resulting in higher inflation, higher current account deficit, that sort of macro vulnerabilities. This time around, we are seeing the reverse of it. We are seeing a situation where the supply side is expanding much faster, but there appears to be a problem of the demand side growing. I think that's where the key challenge is, that how do we get this demand side growing in line with the supply side? Then we will have a more credible and a stable equilibrium, which will make sure that we have a more sustainable long-term growth strategy.
Right. So this is my question to all three of you. This has been a perennial problem, whether it is private investment, whether it is subdued demand, and while we've had several versions of K-shaped recovery, whether it is K-shaped or not, the fact is the demand has been subdued. So while this government has not specifically put money in the hands of the people to boost demand, when it comes to this budget, in terms of a balancing act between continuing with the capex push, fiscal consolidation, and giving demand a push, which lever, according to you, should the government go for? Mr. Joshi.
Well, I think I would first bat for fiscal consolidation because, as Dr. Srivastava was also pointing out, I think we've also committed to a path which brings down the deficit to 4.5% of GDP by 25-26. So first preference, I think, on to be on that path to give comfort to everyone that we are on fiscal consolidation path. Second is, I think, within whatever means you have for spending, I think the focus on the capex, because capex would increase your productive capacity, and I think it also makes it easier to fiscally consolidate over the medium run, because once your capacity goes up, your growth goes up, and we all know that with higher growth, fiscal consolidation always becomes easier. So I think that's the order of my priority.
Okay, Dr. Srivastava.
Well, as long as we are financing investment demand by borrowing by the government and the public sector entities, I think it is better to focus on creating demand through the investment side. Export demand is also going to be weak. And therefore, again, the direction is quite correct in terms of emphasizing investment boost. And as long as India continues to remain deficient in infrastructure, it will add to capacity and it will add to supply, which is fine, because investment also adds to demand and also adds to capacity. But there is also the issue of making sure that a lot of vulnerable sections of the society and a lot of issues with creation of employment are also attended to. For that purpose, we have to then boost to some extent social sector spending. This interim budget, we may expect that not much substantive things may be done, but maybe as the Prime Minister said, we may have certain messages and indications of directions. And there, again, the choice would be in terms of putting additional disposable income in the hands of people, or again, is directing expenditure such that even it creates assets in the hands of households. For example, this scheme of rooftop solar panels being put is actually going to add capacity and therefore would add to demand as well as supply side. So I think we are at a juncture where we have to establish a balance between boosting demand and boosting supply.
Samiran, your thoughts?
So, Shweta, this is one of those things where the ideal answer is not this or that. The ideal answer is this and that. But in an ideal world, fiscal policy should play, according to me, only a redistributional role, which means that whatever taxes we are collecting from the rich, that should just be spent on the poor, nothing more, nothing less. But because we don't live in an ideal world, we are now forced to think of fiscal policy as the main driver for capex in this country, which ideally should not be the case. It should be the private sector which should play that role. And because we are forced to do that, the problem is that we are unable to reduce the fiscal deficit number. If you look at from pre-COVID to post-COVID, the only difference that has happened is that the public capex has doubled as a percentage of GDP. Everything else, all the items have come back to the pre-COVID level, except that amount. And that's why our fiscal deficit is still much higher than where it was pre-COVID. So just to summarize, I think we don't have a choice at this point of time. We have to do all three. But in an ideal world, I would rather want fiscal policy to play a redistributional role.
Fair enough. So for a country like India, where the public debt of over 80% as in proportion to the GDP actually adds to India's vulnerabilities. So are we close to that number? As in, are we? Is it that we end up spending so much on capex that we have to cut back on education and healthcare and other such crucial social spending? Samiran.
So, I mean, the maths is very simple. That if we are growing our nominal GDP at more than 10%, and if our fiscal deficit is less than 5%, both these conditions are necessary for the debt to GDP to start falling. At this point of time, we are definitely meeting one condition, but may not be meeting the other conditions. That's why we need to get our fiscal deficit to GDP ratio below 5% if we want this debt to GDP number to keep on falling. As long as it is on a declining trend, I think the absolute number does not make a big difference.
Okay, sure. Samiran, I know that you have to leave, so please feel free to log off. Thank you so much for joining us. I have one more question for Mr. Joshi and Dr. Srivastava. In the budget, in the last budget, the assumption of economic growth was 10.5% in nominal terms. Now, this year, according to the advance estimates, growth is likely to be at about 8.9%. So, what is the growth number that you will be looking out for, which would actually, mean that which would actually translate into a feel-good factor and translate into more jobs and generally a sense of greater well-being in the economy? Mr. Joshi and Dr. Srivastava.
Well, I think if you're asking an abstract question, I think we have to grow above 7%. I think to grow the size of the cake, which we can also redistribute through policies. But I think coming back to the budget assumptions, I think we are factoring in a real GDP growth of around 6.4% for the coming fiscal year. and nominal somewhere between 10.5 to 11, I think, some in that range. So we expect, I think, so last year it was an unusual situation because the WPI had fallen so much. I think that led to deflator being very small, and so the nominal growth was weak. I think in the coming year, we'll have a different scenario where real growth will be lower, but nominal growth will be higher because WPI inflation will be higher than what it was last year. So clearly, I think I would say between 10.5 to 11% growth is a good number to go by. And I think that is also is going to support your fiscal consolidation.
Okay, Dr. Srivastava, would you like to comment on this, please?
Well, I think the combination possibly that the government will go for is 7% real growth and 4% IPD-based inflation for FY25, which might give us 11% plus for nominal GDP growth. That, in fact, would be a very good message for the policy watchers at large, because this year, the tax buoyancy has been pretty robust, particularly direct tax buoyancy. And I think the assumption may be close to 1.2 or so for the gross tax revenue buoyancy. And therefore, at 11%, we might get maybe 13.2 to 13.5% growth in gross tax revenues. That will enable the government to sustain growth at 7% plus in real terms and still bring down the fiscal deficit from 5.9% to, let us say, about 5.2, 5.3%. That would be a good directional change.
Okay, very quickly, Dr. Srivastava, I also want to get your thoughts on the social sector schemes. Now, what we are hearing is that Pradhan Mantri Kisan Yojana might see a push in this budget again. We might see some other schemes getting a push. In your view, should the government go down that path, considering there is pain in, especially at the at the grassroots economy level?
Well, my sense is that as long as the schemes are existing and it is only a budgetary expenditure that is to be announced with respect to those schemes, then some incremental increase can definitely be allowed, including the Krishi Samman Nidhi and the extension of the free food supply scheme and so on. It is, in fact, budgeting for some new scheme which might involve considerably large expenditure is not something that would be warranted in an interim budget. I think the budget will be used more for messaging and directional indications rather than making large expenditure commitments on additional social sectors.
Okay, Mr. Joshi, any indications on what's the tone and what's the direction or the Diksha, as the Prime Minister termed it? Could this budget really, what would you like to see the budget put forth?
Well, I think I would like to see their commitment for medium term, uplifting the medium term growth trajectory, both in action as well as in their communication. Because I feel that increasing your growth is equally important. I mean, if our growth was weak right now, I think our fiscal problems would have been much, much bigger. So I think we need to push growth. I think redistribution will be easier, I think, if you are also able to grow your economy faster.
Okay, Dr. Srivastava, last question to you. Mr. Joshi has said push growth through this budget. How can the government do that, considering the private sector continues to lag behind when it comes to investments in the economy? Anything that you think the budget can do to give that final push or that nudge?
Yeah, that perspective that we have is IMF came with its revised numbers yesterday, and it is indicating 6.7% for FY24 and 6.5% for FY25 and 26. Whereas the economic review by the Ministry of Finance is indicating 7%. I think 7% plus would be quite ideal under the circumstances, because global condition is so posing such a significant challenge. So I would like to see 7% real growth. I would like to see inflation at about 4%. And that would allow us, with a buoyancy of slightly higher than 1, enough fiscal room to actually also show a convincing path of fiscal consolidation.
All right, so the message is loud and clear for the government, for Ms Sitharaman, who will be presenting the interim budget in less than 24 hours from now. Stick to the path of fiscal consolidation. India's numbers are under great scrutiny. In fact, they've probably not been put under this much of a scanner as they will be tomorrow, considering India has made it to the bond indices. So thank you so much to Mr. Joshi, Dr. Srivastava and Samiran for putting the context so clearly for us and laying out the priorities for India's economy at this point. We'll of course keep tracking the budget and all the stories related to it on moneycontrol.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you.